Welcome everybody. Buenas tardes a todos y todas. Bienvenido a este evento. I am Gerardo Monk, faculty at University of Southern California, Department of Political Science and International Relations. And this is an event to discuss a book recently published by Professor Carol Weiss. This is an event sponsored by the relatively new USC Center for Latinx and Latin American Studies. This is an initiative at USC. Many of us are involved in this. So we're going to be discussing a book by Professor Carol Weiss. She's a professor from the Department of Political Science and International Relations. She's a colleague of mine. Carol Weiss is an expert in IP, international political economy, with an emphasis on Latin America. The book that we're going to be discussing is called Dragonomics: How Latin America is Maximizing or Missing Out on China's International Development Strategy. She's also working these days on a comparative project comparing Latin America and Eastern Europe, looking at developments in both of those regions. So Professor Weiss is going to present some comments, and then we have a guest from Chile. It's a great pleasure to welcome Francisco Urdinez. He's assistant professor at La Catolica. That's how we know the Pontificia, Universidad Catolica of Chile, one of the main centers for political science research within Latin America. He teaches in what we would call the Department of Political Science. It's called the Institute of Political Science. He's interested in issues of political economy of Latin America. He's also interested in Asia and China. So he's a perfect fit as a discussant on this project. So that's all I'll say. What we'll do is start with a brief presentation by Carol, then Francisco will make some comments, and then we'll open to have a discussion with everybody. Okay, Carol, the floor is yours.
Oh, mute. Thank you so much. I am really delighted to be here. For those of you who are not aware of this, this is our new Center for Latinx and Latin American Studies. I'm really proud to be a part of it. It took us a long time to make this happen. So since I'm looking at the time, I'm going to share my PowerPoint. It's not a long PowerPoint. It's actually the bare bones of the book and the argument. Then we're going to turn, as Jerry said, to Francisco for comments, and then we're going to keep it, we'll make it wide open for Q&A. So bear with me as I, I need to be, Juan, I need to be made co-host again. Are you there?
Give me 1 second.
Thank you, sorry. I love seeing you, Glauco.
Okay, you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Here we go. Okay. My students are used to this really sad, constant search for, let's see here. All right, the PowerPoint. I really apologize. Here it is. Okay. Can you see it?
Not yet.
No.
Okay, now.
You should share your, did you share your screen, Carol?
I shared the screen. Let me go. All right, see, here we go. Got it. Got it. All right.
That works.
Now you can see it, right? Yes, great. Okay, so the book came out on Amazon 1 year ago, and that was probably the worst time in history, recent history, to publish a book, right? The pandemic, the quarantine, and whatnot. I had been holding off on doing any big promotion of it, thinking that we'd all be back together in person by now. Wrong. So I figured it's time to begin doing presentations on Zoom. Not my first choice, but here we go. Let me just say that it took me 5 years to write the book, including the research. When I started it, I was aware that Latin America had been deepening its ties very quickly with China as of the early 2000s. And the rapidity with which the relationship grew became really one of the biggest changes for Latin America, probably since the debt crisis of 1982. So China is the first trade partner of half the countries in the region. It is not a significant investor. In 2018, the US invested $1 trillion in Latin America. China invested maybe $124 billion. So you're going to see, I'm going to show you the talking points in a moment, but let me just give, this is a quick snapshot of the trajectory here, which is that China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 kicked it up to a new level of industrial export-led development. China is a resource-poor country. It has coal, and it does not have enough arable land to grow crops to feed itself. So hence, the boom was on for China in terms of WTO entry, gaining access, most favored nation access to the entire membership. And so on the Latin American side, in 2003, what we start to see are numbers that I have never seen before. The Argentine economy had completely imploded in 2001 and 2002. In late 2003, early 2004, Argentina's sales of soybeans to China had jumped 16% on the commodity price index. That is huge, all right? Brazil, the same thing. It was also in a big funk. So you're starting to see these amazing, exports and jumps ahead. Policymakers themselves were shocked, right? Because they had been really, especially Argentina, problems with the International Monetary Fund and whatnot. So the long and short of it is that China kicked off probably the biggest commodity price boom we have ever seen in modern economic history. There's debates about that. And in Latin America, where so many of the countries are resource rich, it pushed the average growth of the region, I call it Latin America and the Caribbean, LAC, up to 6% on average between 2003 and 2007. That was slowed because of the global financial crisis that hit in 2008, 2009. But the commodity prices rebounded quickly. So what you saw for a full decade from 2003 to 2013 are the most amazing numbers on sales of commodities, growth, etc. All right. So one of the big questions is, what happens when the boom ends? This is always, my favorite professor, Carlos Diaz Alejandro, when I was in graduate school, said that they always end in tears, commodity booms. So they did end in big tears for Brazil and Argentina. Chile and Peru are another story altogether. These are not industrial manufacturing exporters. They have relied on minerals and agriculture for 150 years. And so Mexico also I'd say it's a wash for Mexico. So what I do is I take the countries that formed the strongest ties with China during this period. I look at Mexico. I look at Argentina and Brazil as two cases together. I look at Chile and Peru as two cases together, which I will explain. Reviewers on the book were very critical that I did not write a chapter on Ecuador and Venezuela. Given space limitations, I had 90,000 words, right? I would say that I did not write a chapter on those two because there was really no basis for theory expansion or theory building there, those were classic resource curses, where the boom was squandered, the bust was horrible. Venezuela, it's been exacerbated by authoritarian rule. It's a humanitarian crisis. Those are sad cases, and I'm going to write more on them separately in terms of debt trap and all of this, but they don't offer anything new. We have seen the resource curves and the boom and bust many times in the developing countries. At the end of the book, I sat back and I looked at one of the biggest lessons, which is that China's entry into the region at this time opened up for the first time in their history, in their modern history, right? Alternatives and opportunities for new kinds of capital flows, lending for infrastructure, foreign direct investment, and booming trade. But it also opened up a lot of room for corruption. The Ecuadorian and Venezuelan stories are mainly about corruption. It's very sad, but it's not, it's not anything new. Okay, the growth slowed. Chinese growth slowed in 2013. The boom ended in 2014. And now we're going to go and look at the summarizing points here. And then I'm going to present the country narratives, is what I call them, with regard to the countries that I just mentioned. Now, we've been through a rough 4 years with regard to especially U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America. And one of the roughest things was the designation of the Trump administration, and especially the outgoing Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, as China as a competitor, a rival, predatory, and especially predatory encroachment into Latin America. So I frame this as China's internationalized development strategy. China is in Africa, it's in South Asia, it's in Latin America, and it's in places that offer two kinds of things. They offer export, commodities to China, oil, natural gas, fish meal, soybeans, these kinds of things, copper. And the other thing is that these countries are major consumers of Chinese manufactured goods, right? So Barbara Stallings, my colleague and friend, wrote a book just recently about, a new dependency in Latin America with regard to animal alert, the new dependency in Latin America with regard to, Latin America exporting agricultural goods and minerals, and importing manufactured goods. I'll address that in just a minute. But I do insist that the entry of China into the Western Hemisphere, the southern part of it, has not threatened U.S. hegemony. The U.S. is still supreme in terms of investment, security, trade, etc. What we saw was during the Trump administration, most of the countries I mentioned pivoting toward China because it was more diplomatic, it was more friendly, and it was more generous, right? So the thing about success or failure, right? Lots of times, a reporter calls me and says, well, was this a success or a failure? Well, it's not black and white. It was successful according to issue areas, sectors, and the kinds of projects that were undertaken. In Argentina alone, we can see a really pretty good job of China modernizing the domestic rail system, but a shockingly bad job in Patagonia, where they're building 2 hydroelectric dams, and the Argentine government just sort of, gave the shop away. So you can see failure and success hand in hand together in one country. You can see it between countries. No country is a raving success. It's mixed, but the small open economies, mainly Chile and Peru, they survived, I would say, intact after the end of the boom. On the Latin American side, there is a clear pattern of path dependence. Now, let me just say a word about that. A lot of the literature said, oh, you know, China just entered into Latin America, and oh, what, you know, what is this? What's going on? And the second chapter of the book, I really had a good time doing. I'm not a historian, but I did a historical analysis of China-Latin America relations, beginning with the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. So what we see is as early as 1954, China is reaching out to Chile for copper sales in the wake of the Great Leap Forward, which caused the Great Famine. Mexico and Argentina sold wheat to China. They made them pay in dollars, right? But they sold a lot of wheat to China because of the starvation. So most of the interaction up until the reform period, which was launched in '78, most of that interaction was political. The Chinese, especially Zhou Enlai, thought there was really something here with regard to people's revolution and, you know, catalyzing the countryside against the city and all of that. In the end, most of the, if you will, radical parties in Latin America went with the Soviets. Okay, so what is the path to penance? When we look at the goods that, for example, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico were exporting to China through this whole period beginning, say, 1952, 1953, it's the same goods, all right? Nothing has changed. And I have been in all of these countries doing research, and, you know, the trade people and the finance people, and they're complaining that, you know, China just wants to buy their raw commodities and sell them industrial goods. That's been going on for 50 or 60 years. That is nothing new. And it raises questions about, for example, in the face of many challenges to industrialize, all three of them basically dropped the ball in terms of becoming, especially Brazil and Mexico, becoming powerful export-led manufacturing powerhouses. We can talk about that later, but the primary goods are the same. And it's only the three small open economies that I look at, which is, I also include Costa Rica, but the core of the argument about the small open economies is Brazil, or sorry, Peru and Chile. These are the only ones that have formed what we would call a new relationship with China. They've signed free trade agreements with China. They've established all kinds of diplomatic initiatives, and they have, if you will, put their relationship with China in the realm of public diplomacy and international law. Let the trade agreements speak to any of the infractions. There's plenty of infractions on both sides, but they're not running to the WTO every 2 weeks, the way we see Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico doing, to file complaints against China that basically don't really go anywhere. Okay, so there was a lot of room for agency, maneuver, a lot of room for amazing opportunities to garner projects at decent interest rates, get new money, get things flowing. And I have to say that Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico could have done much more with this relationship. And so the chapters on the countries, there's three chapters, three case chapters, basically put the China relationship with Brazil, Argentina into the proper political economy context. So let's just see where we've been and where we're going here. This is comparative long-term growth. Now, I was struck by these figures. The so-called Washington consensus, market forms, neoliberalism really got going in the early 90s, and it halted in 2000 because of these series of, meltdowns. Argentina, Brazil, Mexico is teetering, right? But if we look at the 1990s, this is not the commodity boom period. Growth, with hindsight, was pretty good in these countries. I was surprised. And of course, I've stuck China in there, and Mexico and Brazil are the lowest growers at this time, but the biggest economies have the more factors to absorb. They're usually not as fast growing as, say, Chile and Peru. Okay, and then the 2001 to 2019 period covers both the boom and the bust. The 2019 figures do not take into account the effects yet of the pandemic and the whatever depression we're in right now, right? But one thing to look at here is, okay, so what's the big picture over the China boom during this period? Let me move to the next slide because it's got per capita income. And I insist that the real figure, the really important figure here is per capita income, annual average growth of per capita income. So in the big soybean exporters, Argentina and Brazil, the time period of the boom, it was great. Look at that, 4.3% for Argentina. It was fantastic for per capita growth. They were coming off of a deep slump in per capita income in the 90s. So the following period, which is the aftermath of the bust, the prices dropping, Argentina and Brazil both lose about half of the per capita gains that they had managed to accrue during the boom period. Chile's really kind of breaking even there, but it's the two big, ostensibly emerging economies that didn't do so well. Where did Mexico? Yeah, Mexico also is kind of, on the fence there. So I'm not going to work in counterfactuals. I'm not going to say, oh, if there hadn't been a boom, would this be better? But I will say that the aftermath of the boom, 2014 up until the present, has caught especially Argentina and Brazil in a deep depression, all right? So I've got three clusters, as I said, with Mexico. I use Ha-Joon Chang's model of kicking away the ladder. I call this neoliberal industrial export-led development. It's still going on, whereby the state has taken away all industrial policy and all incentives, turned it over to foreign direct investors, and hence what we see in Mexico are these really lackluster growth and per capita growth figures. Argentina and Brazil, I look at the new literature on resource curse. They had an institutional resource curse, which is to say that when the boom hit, the institutions that were managing it were, what's their name? Acemoglu and Robinson in Why Nations Fall would call these extractive institutions, exclusive institutions, versus productive institutions and institutions that are more inclusive. Okay, so Mexico is the big loser here. It's been most adversely affected by China's rise because this is the one country that is not still exporting just primary goods to China. They are exporting some high value added goods. However, they are exporting a minuscule amount and they're carrying a $76 billion trade deficit with China as we speak now. Okay, so let's just go competitive disadvantage. Mexico was one of the big supporters of China's entry into the World Trade Organization. Big rallying of support for China in 1971 to join the UN. But this dynamic of Chinese manufactured exports encroaching on emerging economies that are ostensibly also manufactured exporters, it began as early as 1993. The timing couldn't be worse because Mexico was rallying to get into the North American Free Trade Agreement, and China was preparing a series of serious reforms, implementing them to get into the World Trade Organization. So Mexico just, handed basically, took no special perks, no special developing country, advantages, and really opened up its capital and its trade accounts very quickly. And this was it was not propitious in terms of per capita growth and development. It just put most of the export sector in U.S. foreign companies. It's a sophisticated contract assembler. Okay, so China and Mexico have got big competition that turned and got better when the US declared the US-China trade war because suddenly US producers, electronics, auto parts and whatnot were buying more from Mexico than they had been from China because the Chinese goods were under tariffs by the US. Okay, hang on just a minute. I have to get rid of the dog. Sorry. Okay, all right, thank you. Sorry. Okay, so the China-Mexico relationship, there's a trade deficit. Chinese foreign direct investment in Mexico is, over this whole time period, is only $6.6 billion. Peru's higher, Brazil's higher, Argentina's higher. So we'll get to that in the Q&A, all right? The free trade agreement route. Now there's something about these free trade agreements that made them viable for Peru and Chile, and this was the following. It was the willingness of China to take some 500 goods in the Chilean case, just take them off the negotiating table. So any domestic manufacturing, home appliances, these kinds of machine tools, these kinds of things that were, deemed sensitive in Peru, were not subjected to Chinese competition. They did not have to lower the tariffs. That was a win-win because China could care less about that industrial sector. It wants the mineral wealth and the agricultural wealth. Chile did the same deal. They exempted less goods, but it's a backdoor kind of industrial policy, and it wasn't a bad idea, quite frankly. The domestic sectors are still hurting from Chinese competition in both countries, but they're not decimated the way we'd see in other countries. Okay, let me just go to, all right, now, I take some of these measures from the global governance, database, and I use regulatory quality as a way to talk about, or at least get at, the performance. And this is key. What does China want? They want to invest big money in big projects. And even though it is foreign direct investment, it's the state-owned enterprises and their go out and whatnot. So what kind of shape are these countries in to really handle, say, 2 hydroelectric dams in Patagonia? Well, if we look at Argentina, during the period that these dams were negotiated and after, they gave up. Look at this on regulatory quality. They're in this database out of I don't know, 150 countries, or like 148. It's really shocking. Brazil could have done better. Now the hitch here, and this gets at a tax on, Washington consensus, is that China's regulatory quality isn't that good either. So the Chinese are willing to come in with like bad regulatory norms. And the question is, if a country lets them, they'll do it. The Chileans have said no. The Mexicans have said no. Peru has been pretty good, and Costa Rica, in drawing the line in terms of labor abuse, environmental encroachment, shady deals that, limiting the presence of Chinese labor, inputs and whatnot. So this is it. China is willing to come in under any terms, it is up to the country to really, the study that I'm doing now in Eastern Europe and China and the Belt and Road, diffusing itself into this region, it really shows how membership in the European Union for those countries like Poland and Hungary just really added a layer of regulatory oversight, transparency, investment norms and whatnot that Latin America doesn't have. Brazil's are pretty good. Brazil has pretty good, competitive bidding for infrastructure and whatnot. And they've held the Chinese back on, bringing in all of their own labor and inputs. But Argentina's been mixed. And Mexico, they have not been able to really seal any big deals with China. We can talk about that in the Q&A. I talked about path dependence in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico with regard to China. But the little countries show us, and this is from Douglas North, right, that, you know, he talks about the automaticity of policy failure and how, you know, the repetition of institutional failure and whatnot. And what I like about these small cases is they show that, you know, they're examples of breaking out of path dependence. The Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. Okay, let me stop, because they have not only, especially Argentina and Brazil, that they have not only the deep recession, borderline depression from the end of the commodity boom that is now being exacerbated by the pandemic depression. And, you know, it raises a question like, how depressed can you really get? Mexico, they say that the depression level is where they were in 1932. However, some of that's self-inflicted. So let me stop. Let me turn this over to Francisco. I met Francisco just about 1 year ago at a workshop in Lima, Peru on Belt and Road. I love meeting young up-and-coming scholars. He is my new Latin American, you know, rising star, and I am just so really thrilled to have you here. I really think the world of his work.
There. Thank you very much. For me, it's a pleasure. I do received my copy of the book a few months ago, and I enjoyed it very much. For those working on China-Latin American relations, this is the book that everyone has wished to write. It summarized very well the debate, and today I would like to maybe present 3 contributions that I think this book does very well to the field. First of all, for those who are not familiar with the literature on China-Latin American relations, it's a booming relation. It's a booming literature. It's as booming as the commodities during the 2000s. These are articles published in Web of Science yearly, discussing China-Latin American relations. And Carl Weiss's book summarizes these debates really well. And interestingly, the first sentence of the book says this is not a book about China. And I think that's very true. I mean, she brings all her experience, past experience on Latin American, Asian relations, as well as her very deep knowledge on the Washington Consensus to discuss lessons, development lessons in Latin America that we can take from China's commodity boom. So this is a book where China is an independent variable, that is to say. The second lesson that we get, as she presented a few minutes ago, is that she provides very valuable policy lessons. I think this book should be read by policymakers as well. Actually, I enjoyed it very much. I work on this field, but it's a book that it's very clear and can be read by anyone who's not well familiar with the field, which is something that I find very appealing. And as she presents these sort of 3 ideal type models, where she finds Chile, Peru, and Costa Rica making openness work, I would encourage policymakers to read the book, even looking towards a new, maybe a new commodity super cycle. So to learn how not to fall into category B and C as well, how not to make the mistakes that Argentina and Brazil did towards China's boom. Indeed, in my opinion, the last year or 2 years or so have shown us that Peru and Chile might also kind of fall into category B. from making openness work, they may fall into an institutional resource course towards China at least. Let's remember that they export mostly copper, and their main buyer is China. And there's been, at least in Chile in the last few months, a huge discussion on how dependent Chile has become on China lately. The lessons that Carl brings from many years of studying this topic are still very relevant. And they will still be very relevant, maybe even more so after the pandemic. Um, so uh, I'm also very sorry that we cannot gather personally and have a meeting in California or in Lima or wherever to discuss the book. I still think that this book is still getting more and more relevant as the pandemic evolves, because these three scenarios are getting accentuated. Um, and as a third, well, I put here a picture of the commodity super cycles, because I wanted you to remember that we might be entering into a new super cycle soon. We still don't know, but for instance, in Chile, everyone is very happy that copper is almost at its peak value now. Soy also is peaking, and you know, if this happens again, we may have a new chance to apply what Carl discusses as policy lessons. And third, and related to this second point, I think that her book interacts very well with recent literature, uh, which is not necessarily on China. And while I was rereading the book a few days ago, I thought of two very recent books that have been published this year as well. One of them is The Volatility Course by Campello and Suco. They discuss how commodities um, define the success or failure of presidents. And when commodities are at low values and interest rates are high, it's almost impossible for a Latin American president to get reelected and to promote a pro-distributive agenda. And in part, the explanation for that volatility curve in the last 15 years or so has been China. So for me, both books read very well together. At the same time, and this is something that still need to be addressed in the literature by those who study these agendas, is how China's rise, even in successful cases like Chile, has created winners and losers within countries, which have accentuated inequalities, the inequality that also has an impact on democratic institutions. Indeed, Campello and Suco have dedicated a chapter to discuss how Chile managed to get shielded from the volatility course, which is by implementing counter-cyclical policies. And Carl also brings that discussion, and I think that's starting to be an issue in the literature. How can we implement, we as Latin Americans, how can Latin American countries implement now counter-cyclical policies to save when China buys a lot of commodities, and to be able to spend when China stops buying, or when a pandemic hits, or when a trade war starts. I think there was not such a plan in most countries in the region, and that's what Carl describes very well. I think this book will be very much used not only in Latin American China courses, which of course will be a main book of reference, but also in IPE courses which discuss current topics that are being discussed in the region. So I find that very appealing about this book. Last but not least, so I would like also to open the room for questions and comments from from the audience to Carl's book, about Carl's book. The book opens an agenda, of course. There's been a lot that's been said about China's engagement in Latin America. And I think there are three key issues that this book raises, but are left open. Again, this is a book where China is an independent variable. And as Carol said, it's a book about Latin America, not about China. Then a lot of questions arise to reader. And it has to do with how's Latin America going to adapt to this rise of China globally, and more specifically in the region. I am very interested in the third dimension lately, which has to do with the soft power. There's been, besides what she describes in the book, a growing anti-China sentiment in Latin America. So while China was seen a few years ago as a miracle, nowadays it's seen as a phenomenon which can be also very hurtful. It's sort of a variable that creates and accentuates inequalities within countries, and that might be the explanation for why it lacks soft power, as well as the fact that it's an autocratic regime. But Latin America for China might be a case of overstretching. That is, it's a region very far from China, where it's very hard for China to be loved. And I think that's something very interesting that this book opens and needs to be understood in depth. We have seen that during the pandemic. We have seen, for instance, in the case of the mask diplomacy, and we are witnessing that now with regards to the Chinese vaccines. So Dragonomics opens a lot of topics and questions that are still very relevant and will be very relevant in the following years. I am honored to that Carl joined me and invited me as a discussant, as a very junior scholar. Again, I see in this book the book that I wish one day I will be able to write. So congratulations. And I have spoken for around 10 minutes. I'm very eager to listen from the audience what sorts of questions may arise from Carl's tale.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Thanks, Carol, as well. So the floor is open for comments. Anybody that wants to ask something, you can raise your hands. You can put questions in the chat. Let me read one here, sort of from the chat, by Kevin Covarrubias. Are there any reliable public opinion surveys for 2019, 2021 on Latin American public opinion toward China's national image? I guess this goes to Francisco's comment. Latino Barometer only lists data until 2018.
I can answer these and then give and let Carl continue with the reply. Just because I carried out a survey experiment last year on China's perception in the region. Carl has shown us that China has created sort of three groups of countries. And I'm very curious to understand how people within those countries diverge in how they perceive China. If you let me share the screen and I will show you what I've found. And it has to do with the mask diplomacy. Kevin was the one asking the question. Historically, China was had a very positive image in the region, around 90%, and it was very stable. Lately, there's signs that that's starting to change. The Pew Research Center showed some evidence of this in Western Europe and North America. And in Latin America, I took a group of 6 countries. I think they overlap with Carl's countries as well, where to some people I showed them news on how China was donating respiradores. How do you call them in English? Ventilators.
Yes, yeah.
And how they were contributing to deal with the crisis of coronavirus in Latin America. We saw lots of this news down here. And then there was a second treatment, which was a little more negative because it mentioned that information coupled with the fact that Trump had criticized China for hiding information on the origin of the virus, and it mentioned the World Health Organization as well. Irrespectively of which treatment each person got, we found that the first thing that came to mind when people thought of China in the region nowadays, it's the virus, of course. You may say, well, that's obvious. Well, the thing is that China may stick with that image for a long time. When we asked the same people to mention the first idea that came to mind when they thought of Japan or the US, for instance, other words appeared. And taking out the virus part, if we classify words by their sentiment in each of these 6-7 countries, what we find is that China has consistently across these 7 countries, other means Uruguay in this chart, China is classified as, or is perceived as a negative, or it raises negative feelings. And that's independent of which treatment the person got. This is just very preliminary evidence, but I brought these slides because I was expecting someone to ask about the public opinion of China in this regard, and I thought it was a good opportunity to comment on this, because I think that what Kevin is asking, it's something that the book Dragonomics and all the literature that we have until now opens up as a question. I think we still need to understand all the consequences of China's rise in the region, on how it is being perceived, and even more so, how can and could become an issue in elections, in presidential elections, for instance.
Carol, do you want to say something on that?
No, go ahead. Those slides were great. Danielle's waiting.
Yeah, Danielle, please unmute and ask your question.
Okay, buenas tardes. My name is Daniel Liebertrue. I'm an American graduate student here in Valparaiso, Chile. And I'm actually your official Zoom bomb. I saw on Twitter, on Francisco's Twitter account this morning, that this was gonna happen. And I've got the book. I'm writing my thesis on Chile and Peru, doing a case study on the 2 of them with regards to their interactions with China. So very relevant to what I'm doing right now in my studies. But my questions for you, Professor Weiss, I'm really interested in Barbara Stallings' take on dependency. I'm using her Cambridge element as well for my marco teórico for the kind of the framework. And I look at Chile and Peru as becoming market dependent, particularly copper for both countries, cherries for Chile, fish meal for Peru. And I play with, what does that market dependency look like if China does something along the lines of what they did to Australia over the summer, when they went through that little Twitter war, and China cut off some of the imports from Australia. The implications for it, are there risks there for that in Latin America? And then just as price takers, how did Chile and Peru deal with just the size of the market here in China? And thank you again.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in from Chile. Dependency theory is not new. It's got so many iterations, and I insist that it is still a very, right on target description of conditions in most developing countries, not emerging economies, but developing countries, right? I mean, you still have poverty, you've still got tremendous inequality and these things. So if you look at this, most developing countries are dependent, all right? Dependent on some market and some, bigger state like the US or China. So I think, to me, dependency theory is too deterministic. It can't explain the rise of China, quite frankly, right? It can't explain how countries climb out of the so-called periphery, go into the semi-periphery, and make it through the threshold to a developed country, which would be Korea, Japan. Chile's been in the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the Rich Country Club, since, I believe, 2012. So, I mean, where is the mechanism for change in this theory? And I don't see that. We're getting reviewed. My book and her are being reviewed together in a number of places. And I've been debating with her about this. So I don't see the mechanism for change. It's a very vivid description that I really agree with. So let me just say that if dependency theory were still alive and well, then, how would it explain the fact that Peru and Chile have, made it through the long period from, 91 to 2019 with pretty good performance, pretty good per capita income growth. And I would argue one of the big things about, a dependent state, right, is very bad macroeconomic policy. And so what we saw in both countries are amazing institutional reforms. A lot of them were, response in the case of Peru to hyperinflation, to all kinds of disruption. Chile, that came earlier. But we have seen a really important process of institutional change such that they have managed inflation, interest rates, budgets, and all of these things, and anti-poverty programs in a way that saved them. I mean, the prices dropped. It was rough, but they've also, if you look at the diversification of exports, each of them is exporting, I think, 25% to the US, 25% to the region, 25% to Europe. It may be an increased percent now to China. So although the minerals are everything, they've always been everything. And so the question is, how do you manage it? How do you hedge your bets, right? Now, this thing that happened to Australia, you don't want to get in that bind. You really don't want to go there. But that is, Australia is like a big player in the Pacific Basin market. These are little players, right? These are little players, and they've learned to be more agile. I will also say that they had already negotiated a free trade agreement, each of them with the US, prior to doing it with China. So when China's offering exceptions in industry, and they're offering, other kinds of things that make the China free trade agreement more palatable to domestic voters and producers, there we went. I know that the Peruvians, I'm less familiar with Chile. I'm in Peru a lot. And I know the Peruvians were infinitely more upset about the US-Peru free trade agreement than they were with the Peru-China free trade agreement. But let's be very clear. Chile really held the line. They did not let China buy out, state-held copper assets. The Chinese were all, ready to go with mergers and acquisitions. But they held the line and they wanted Chinese investment in other sectors, preferably high value added, maybe some tech. They went from very low foreign direct investment to almost $11 billion just over the last several years. So it's not the high tech that they were looking for, but it is solar panels, other things that at least to the Chileans indicate some diversification away from straight commodity, straight extractive investments. So, I think that dependency, again, I'm sorry, like Ecuador, Venezuela, Haiti, Jamaica, right? That is an apt description, but it's not an explanation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just very quickly, there's a Huawei data center coming into Santiago, services and some of those things, to your point, Professor Weiss, in Chile too. So they're starting to get some of that investment.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Francisco can comment on that more. If you don't mind, can I reach out to you via email? I'd love to continue the discussion because I know a lot more about Chile and less about Peru as I'm developing these case studies and I'm kind of at the tail end of my thesis, if you don't mind.
Always, yes, always reach out.
Great.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Glauco. Please unmute. Glauco, can you please unmute?
Unmute.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, now, yeah.
Yes.
This is my doctoral student. When did you graduate?
In 2009.
2009, oh my God, more than 10 years. And he's like a big technocrat in the Brazilian government. I'm so proud you're here.
No, it's really my pleasure, Professor Carol, to meet you here. It's really a very important time, and I wish to praise the book. It's been such an opportunity. I'm looking forward to read the full book. I've read some extracts, and I'm currently working at the government, but I'm working at a governmental think tank in Brazil. So I'm not working in the ministries anymore. So we are kind of more of a think tank that tries to think about important issues. It's called the Institute of Applied Economic Research, and it has a new department. It has 50 years or more than 50 years of history, but now it has an international studies department that is trying to look over these important issues. In China, it's an important issue. We are just embarking on a new research agenda comprising China and my department over there. And I think the book it's released on a very important time, and to be more precise in terms of what we are trying to understand. It's about the relationship with China, the expansion of the investments in other markets. As the book discusses, China as a former developing country has been managed to overcome the path dependency and be entering some high-end markets and some important markets. And we know that infrastructure is a very important point here in Brazil. And as a soy exporter, there is a sentiment of how the Chinese investment could try to improve the infrastructure. At the same time, there is a lot of politicians and the business people who are suspicious about the Chinese investment in Brazil as well. So there is the sentiment that Professor Urdinez kind of portrayed a couple of minutes ago, and it's a challenge for Brazilian policymakers to kind of deal with this new whole. Of course, we have this the question of the BRICS and how Brazil gets along with China outside the BRICS, and in a time that there is a lot of an anti-Chinese sentiment in this Brazilian government. So we are launching this research agenda in IPEA, which is the body that I work now, this think tank. And I'm looking forward to talk to Professor Wise and to read the book and hoping to discuss some of the issues. And we are planning a lot of outputs. One of them could be a book and some policy-oriented research about China relations with Latin America, and as I said, with other parts of the world as well. And just to wrap up, a point that is very good for us, very important for us, is how China is dealing with the expansion of the Belt and Road initiative, expanding their investments in countries that have a very poor regulatory quality, as Professor Wise just mentioned. For instance, countries in Africa. And she kind of answered our question, my question. It's been the investment has been stronger in countries that have a better quality, regulatory quality and institutional quality. So these are my remarks, and my pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Glauco. Carol, do you want to comment?
I'm going to say a few things. First of all, congratulations. That's a wonderful think tank. I've been to the one in Rio, and it's so high quality. So I'm very happy for you, and I'm very proud of you. Now, I'm very critical of Brazil in the book, all right. Although, at the end of the day, I mean, come on, the Petrobras scandal, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. I mean, come on. At least they put some people in jail finally. But Brazil has the best possibility right now to really take advantage of Chinese diversification of investment into the manufacturing sector. That is, the big commodity investments have been made, the hydroelectric, the Belo Horizonte, all of these. And so now, China is looking to Brazil for investments that every country in the region wants, but Brazil is more capable to host these. And of course, it's got the biggest domestic market. I will say that when you look at Brazil's regulatory framework, it's uneven, as many are, but Brazil does competitive tenders, bidding. They do, for projects, they've got regulatory oversight in terms of, I think they limit 15% of Chinese input, including labor, parts, engineering, construction. So the Brazilians actually have done pretty well with regard to China. I had a really interesting interview with the Brazilian ambassador to Beijing in the summer of 2019. And the big question is, why didn't Brazil rush to sign the memorandum of understanding with China when they announced the, in the CELAC meeting in 2018 in Santiago, the Chinese said, oh, we're going to expand this to Latin America. I think 17 countries rushed to sign up, right? A lot of them from the Caribbean, and Brazil did not rush to sign up. And the thought there was that this is, his name is escaping me, but he was really sophisticated. He said, it's too basic for us. The MOU memoranda are just vague, and we can't do business at that level. These are big projects, and we're not going to sign some memoranda for the Belt and Road where we're perhaps getting into situations that they don't want to cope with. So Glauco, we need to have a Zoom in the near future and talk more. I'm looking at the time, but I'm just delighted you're here, and let's continue this.
Sure. It's my pleasure. It will be good.
Hernan.
Thank you, Carol and Francisco, and congratulations, Carol, on the book. This is a really great discussion. I wanted to get your thoughts on a specific issue, and some of this has been mentioned by others. As you know, my focus is on the high tech and telecom sector, and this is a great example of the dependency of Latin America on Chinese investment. You have Huawei, ZTE, and a few other companies that completely dominate really every step of the telecom markets in Latin America. But I was struck by your presentation and your idea that the United States still very much the main investor and the main player in Latin America. So my comment is, and as you know, the US has been on this neck-to-neck fight with China on 5G investments, and has led, or the previous administration led a not very successful campaign to try to convince other countries to disinvest from Chinese network vendors in 5G. And again, this is an example of what you explore in the book. But my question is, how do you see the new administration coming in, whether it's going to continue this kind of campaign to rally other countries to disinvest and lower the dependency, particularly on high-tech industry in China, or do you see a different strategy from the Biden administration?
Well, I think the strategy for the last 4 years was psychotic. I mean, the first thing they should do is let the CFO of Huawei out of jail, right, in British Columbia. I mean, they arrested her and she's been fighting it. And I mean, since when do you arrest CFOs, right, at airports? I think, so, you know, there's ways to get, you know, there's ways to deal with these differences. You know, Hernan, you're touching on a really important issue. So the Central and Eastern European countries are more beholden to the US as a result of the end of the Cold War and all of that. So I spent a semester in the Czech Republic in 2019, and boom, you know, Pompeo goes to Poland, bullies them. They've already got Huawei, bullies them literally to not take the 5G, stop at 4G, goes to Hungary, stop at the 4G. So they got, you know, they used hard power, if you will, threats, you know, to put an end to this in Eastern Europe. Okay, so as a result of a bad history, a long kind of acrimonious history in US Latin American relations, it's not as easy for, you know, the likes of whomever the Secretary of State is now to go down there and say, you know, this is it, you're not going into 5G. So another thing that happened was, and Francisco knows more about this than I do, which is part of this big hype with the Belt and Road was going to be that fiber optic cable that would go from Shanghai to Santiago. And Pompeo did go down there and bully them. And boom, they went with Japan to do the fiber optic cable. So if your question is, are we going to see more of that? I don't know, but I don't think so, because a lot of it was, you know, the export controls now on chips and everything coming in from China. I mean, we have a chip shortage, all right, especially in the auto sector. So, you know, I don't think it's going to be that, if you will, it's both erratic and, you know, counterproductive for U.S. producers in tech sectors. Let me ask you, you're the expert. I mean, is it a security threat if Huawei 5G infiltrates Latin America?
I love when you ask a question and it comes back to you. It's a really good question, Carol. I don't have, you know, I don't think anybody has a ready or an easy answer to that. But I'm curious for Francisco. Do you have experience on this in Chile? And you mentioned, I think somebody mentioned the Huawei investment in a data center, and I believe Amazon and others are also invested in data centers in Chile.
Yes. When we met last time with Carl in Lima, we were invited. It looks like a past life, because it was February 2019. February 2020, Carl, sorry, before the pandemic, Donald Trump was still in power, and we discussed very much the project for a 5G cable uh, starting in China, passing maybe through Australia and reaching Santiago or the shore, not Santiago, maybe Valparaiso or closer. That project has been in the wild pretty much ended. Chile, I would say, my interpretation, there's still a lot of research to be done on this. My interpretation is that American threats worked in the case of Chile, in the sense that Piñera went to China in 2019. It visited Huawei. Indeed, it was going to visit Huawei, but at the end, it didn't due to threats from Pompeo. But people from his government visited the company and they discussed the project. Eventually, Chile decided to sign an MOU with Japan, and nowadays they speak of NEC, the tech Japanese company NEC, being in charge of the project, and the cable would go. It would start not from China, but maybe from Australia, and that would make it easier also regarding the technical part, which is very complex. But from the interviews I've had in the last 2 months on 5G in Chile and in the region in general, they all agree that 5G is still too expensive to be profitable. So it's more a political discussion than an economic discussion yet. Actually, it's being bid, the 5G line in Chile now, even without a 5G cable that goes to Asia. So there's been advance on that regard, keeping Huawei apart. And I think that Huawei will have a tough time getting into at least Chilean market. Last time we saw each other with Carol, we were discussing also how Peru and Chile were kind of competing to attract Huawei. I think Chile now has decided to stop and to leave that competition aside. Well, we should also remember that Chile has been caught in huge trouble, domestic trouble. Peru also. I think it's not a good time to discuss such technology, which is very expensive and it brings a lot of geopolitical problems. I think countries have delayed that discussion a bit in the last year.
I wonder, though, in terms of costs, just the last thing on this, can Huawei undercut U.S. competitors?
Yes, it can. There's a very interesting brochure that the State Department released on 10 myths that kind of debunk why Huawei is a better option. And it recognizes that Huawei is more competitive, but it argues that it is more competitive because of subsidies from the Chinese government. The difference in prices, apparently it's quite large, and it's still the main advantage that Huawei has compared to Ericsson and other European alternatives. But at least, again, in Latin America, that discussion, for what I know, having interviewed some people here in the region, is that it's still too early. So 4G is still enough for us as a pretty backward economy. 5G requires not only a cable, but it requires certain, I would say in Spanish, estaciones de repetición. They are like repeating antennas.
Repeater stations.
Yeah, that need to be very close from each other, very close, less than 500 meters. So it's a huge sunk cost that Chile was projecting, not just for its domestic market, but to be a hub of 5G within the region and sell the infrastructure to Argentina and Brazil and so on. But again, I think that discussion has been, for now, suspended, put on hold. It might, I don't know how, and that has to do with, I have a question as well. I have the right to ask Carl a question, and it's very much related to Hernan's question, which is that you start the last paragraph of the book arguing, you mentioned that you challenge hawkish views or realist interpretations of China's rise in Latin America. And you have done a lot of research on the Washington Consensus and the neoliberal reforms that Latin American countries carried out in the region. I would like to ask you, what do you think the Biden administration will do in regards to providing public goods in Latin America? Why I'm asking this, I think that what your book reflects very well is that China pretty much felt a vacuum, a gap that America left in the 2000s. Do you think that Biden's policy towards the Western Hemisphere will change, or it will remain the same?
Well, that gets
Carol, can you hold your answer? My colleague Maura Urdinez has been waiting very patiently. I know she wants to jump in with some comment, question, and I think Danielle had some also comments. So maybe we could do Maura, Danielle, and then you take the various comments, Carol.
Great.
Maura, you're up.
Thank you so much. Hey, Carol, how you doing? I'd actually like to turn this discussion on its head to go back to the research, the 5G question, to go back to some of the research that you did on commodities, Carol, to talk about the ability of these countries that you created, these three categories, to extract value from China or to move forward. So what I'd like to do is take that 5G question, which whether it be political or economic at this point, it's still, the question is clearly continuing. But when the time comes, might a country like Mexico be, which you said did not do well in the commodity boom because they did not have what they needed, might a country like Mexico be in a position to control or the agreements with, let's just go with Huawei since that's what we've been talking about, or is there something they can do between now and then when the conversation becomes more contundente, I'm sorry, I can't think of what the English word is, contundente, more central to this discussion, then is there something that a country like Mexico can do that we really care about? Because as a former intelligence officer, I would argue that who runs and owns the network has the ability to exploit it in ways that you don't want to know about. So who builds and owns the network does matter very much to us and our neighbor. So is there something Mexico can or needs to do that might put them in a position, a different power position than they were with commodities with China to have a different outcome?
Okay, I've got that in my brain. Okay.
Danielle, do you want to jump in now, and then Carol answers all the questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment on the undersea cable. I'm on a government-funded scholarship. I'm very closely tied in with the embassy here in Santiago, the U.S. embassy here. And so I have on very good information that basically the Chileans said, we're going through New Zealand because it's cheaper. So it speaks very much to that free market piece, and it worked out well from a U.S. standpoint for exactly that reason. Now, instead of it going directly to Shanghai, it's going to go through Auckland in Australia, and so it makes it so that the data and everything else is going to be more secure, if you will. The other piece of it is everyone's talking now that data is the big commodity of the 21st century. And so it was a win just sort of for the Western democracy, free market system to keep Latin America's data within the bubble of democracy, if you will, as well. No question, but thanks again.
Thank you. All right. So Maura is also my former student. 1995, Johns Hopkins. I know, we met when we were 10, right?
If you say so.
Yes, got her master's at Johns Hopkins when I was there. Okay, so moving forward, so many students. Thank you, my students. I can see Haley and Fabian. Thank you. Okay, back to the questions. All right, Biden. Okay, you know, every new administration that has come in since, I would say, in the 2000s, right? I mean, forget Reagan. Bush Senior tried to get this enterprise through America's thing going. But since the Clintons, really, there's been this effort to, throw down the gauntlet. We're really going to get into this, relationship. We're going to make, John Kerry gave a talk at the OAS in 2008 where, the Monroe Doctrine is dead and now it's soft power and we're going to move forward. And it hasn't changed. The relationship hasn't changed. It changed for the worse under the Trump administration, needlessly. Haranguing, racist comments, locking people up in detention centers at the border. I mean, that was a big setback. So I hope that they clear up all of that because, these are human rights offenses, quite frankly. So are they going to clear that up? I very much hope so. Are they going to go further, though? Is this going to be the so-called partnership that, the U.S. administrations have been promising since the early 90s? I don't think so. I doubt it. Latin America has been taken for granted. They don't like the idea of the Chinese coming in so forcefully, but quite frankly, the Chinese are coming in. China is still an emerging economy, and it's coming in with investments and projects that are appropriate to other emerging economies. China has, an excess capacity of all the infrastructure and engineering and construction and whatnot. And now they need to unload it, and they can unload it in other countries that are behind them in infrastructure and the kinds of things that emerging economies desperately need, right? I'm not remembering, Daniel, you might know this answer, but I think Pompeo and Trump launched, they reformed it, and didn't they put like $60 billion into some initiative where it's going to be, infrastructure investment from the U.S. I don't even know if it was 60 billion. It could have been 60 million. I don't know. But, there was that gesture, but it was a hostile gesture. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was, Belt and Road is a debt trap. It's a road to nowhere. This is our enemy, etc. So it was a kind of superficial pseudo Cold War offensive. I don't think it's going anywhere, quite frankly. The Brazilians were laughing at it when I talked to the ambassador, like, give me a break. So I think that, no. Now, what I would like to see is just good old-fashioned, clean up the mess. And again, the mess is largely with Central America and Mexico, but I'm not expecting any big, huge changes. It hasn't happened in 30 years, and I'm not sure what the impetus would be for it now. Now, Maura, this thing about Mexico, it's interesting. I know you chose Mexico. You asked about Mexico because they're on the border with the U.S., but if anything, if we look at the time period since Lopez Obrador was elected 2 years ago, they're going back. They're going backwards. They're putting up barriers, making it very hard for foreign investors, not guaranteeing property rights for investment that is there now. So Mexico is sophisticated enough to do whatever it wants. They, for the first time, have a democratically elected leader that has a majority government. All of the other presidents had minority, control of the Congress and the lower house. So the Senate and the lower house. So anyway, right now it's like, they could do whatever they want to do. Huawei's headquarters are in Mexico City. The question is, they're not even there yet. They're not even thinking about this. Mexico, unfortunately, doesn't seem to be thinking. I mean, Chileans think about the cutting edge. Argentines try to think about it, Uruguay, Brazil, but Mexico's not even thinking about the cutting edge right now. It's just all kind of inward, you know, defensive and nationalistic. I was with the Mexican trade rep in Beijing at the Mexican embassy in Beijing also 2 years ago. And Mexico had an export agency called Pro Mexico that was fabulous. They were so successful, and their agricultural wing was very successful because Mexico doesn't have a lot of commodities to export to China, but they concocted a berry business. So the big juicy blueberries and the raspberries and all of that, all of those were going to China, and tequila. But the current government shut these offices down. No more promotion of Mexican, you know, goods. No more, you know, export-led vision. So it's very sad. Mexico, under different leadership with a different mentality, could, you know, could perhaps. You're wondering if they could handle the security threats with regard to cyberspace.
Well, no, really. Can they extract in any sort of trade relationship or infrastructure relationship that they might do with Huawei? Can they extract advantage or exercise control? Because that's what you talked about in Chile and Peru. Were able in the commodity thing to get their own out of it. I'm not cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Actually do the agreement. Does Mexico have the power to get what they want out of the agreement, do you think?
Okay, so that means transparency. That means competitive bids for different projects, different sections of cables and whatnot. And yes, but they have it on the books, on the records as a result of the North American Free Trade Agreement and the renegotiation of it. They uphold this when it suits them, like when they tendered out those massive new deep water oil reserves on the Gulf of Mexico side of the border. It was squeaky clean, public tenders, competition, because there were big bucks there, and they had a lot of big companies coming in, and you know they did not want that to fail. Now it's kind of going down the tubes, but that's another story for another time. So Mexico, yes, they could, you know, drum up the regulatory, you know, the stamina to get a good deal. But I'll finish here with the so-called $4 billion, you know, high-speed rail that was going to go from Mexico City to Querétaro. And Querétaro in the south is, you know, aviation equipment, medical equipment. It's their high-tech, you know, hub. The deal fell apart with the Chinese for the train because of corruption on the Mexican side, right? Corruption on the Mexican side. So it's all a process. And, you know, I insist that states could get a good deal out of China, but you can't just sit there and wish for it. You've really got to, you know, put your hands on, you know, hands-on energy, and you've got to deal with, you know, communication, interaction, and whatnot. I think
we've run out of time, Carol. Though we could obviously continue. So I think we're going to go, bring this to a close. So thanks again, Carol. Thanks a lot. For the book, for the discussion you generated. Francisco, muchas gracias. And thanks to Juan de Lara, the director of the Latinx and Latin American Center, for bringing us together. And thanks everybody for participating, your questions, your comments. This has been very interesting.
Thank you, Jerry, for the great job moderating as well.
Thank you, yes.
Gracias, Juan.
And thank you for my students. Thank you. I'm so happy I see so many of you. That's very loyal. Thank you very much. We're going way back, right? So I look forward to being in touch with some of you. Thank you so much for coming. Hello, dear. Hello.
Everybody have a good day or evening wherever